housing that supports the needs of new family types. She was formerly associated with the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies in New York City and the Museum of Modern Art there. And she was curator and editor of the exhibit Women in American Architecture, which traveled, and the book which many of us know about. I'd like to introduce Susana Torre.
Let's see if this, can you hear me? You know, having listened to Stuart Coyne the other day, I became sort of super aware of all this flimsy hardware around me. Anyway, first, I would like to say that I'm very pleased to be lecturing in a school that makes such a grand, spatial celebration of a place of work and a place of reunion. It's the only school in the country that I know that, you know, looks and functions in this manner. It's true. Second, I would like to apologize for what, you know, now seems to be a god-awful, pretentious title for this lecture. I couldn't believe it when I read the poster, and was actually improvised over the phone when Richard called me and said, everything is set up, but we don't have a title for the lecture. And I said, oh my God, you know what? And you know, and then I reeled off this sort of like long title, you know, that I guess contains ultimately all the things that I wanted to say, but not quite in exactly that way. In any event, I hope that expectations have not been created by it, because what I want to do tonight is a very informal presentation of, I guess, what you know, I call my theoretical and practical program for work, and my involvement with this housing criteria that I worked out with my students at Syracuse University about a year ago. About 2 months ago, I was asked to produce a very brief statement for an exhibition of young architects at Yale University, you know, sort of young architects, the new generation. And the idea was that in 20 words or less, each one was supposed to state the main intentions of their work. It's one of these ludicrous exercises that you know, say, my God, you know, I'll never be able to put this together ever. On the other hand, it can also be taken as a considerable challenge to be able to make sense out of what you're trying to do and try to put it in a very intense and compressed way. So that is what I did. And I would like to start the presentation by reading that statement and commenting on it, given the fact that the intensity of the short version really leaves a great many things unexplained. This theoretical and practical program included a number of considerations. One was a method of architectural composition that is capable of encompassing both fixed, proportionally related elements and unstable elements. I see this as an extremely important consideration today, practically at every level, in that we lack the formal compositional methods in architecture that enable us to deal with the, you know, what I call the unstable elements, such as the issue of user participation, growth and change due to all kinds of economic and social reasons that affect the fixed order of compositionally close and perfect buildings. The interesting thing is that these formal compositional methods have been developed in other arts, like dance and performance and music. I guess John Cage being a rather notorious early example of this kind of experimentation. But somehow in architecture we seem to have been perhaps unaware or behind in the realization that, well, in that, you know, we continue to cling and cherish the idea of the ideal self-contained, self-referential object that can be designed perfectly in terms of very close compositional systems from beginning to end. The second component of this was a critical theory of function that is capable of redefining the monofunctionalist mechanistic premise of the modern movement in order to embrace all practical, aesthetic, theoretical, and symbolic functions. And what I mean by this is that in the current period of transition that we experience, where we're trying to, in a sense, resolve certain issues by expedient use and sometimes perfunctory use of historical references, there is a great deal of the architectural text that is not taken into consideration. In a sense, the current stylistic text is a text that suppresses a great deal. In fact, it suppresses it so much that it will burst or reemerge, as it usually happens historically, in ways that may be quite unpredictable. But what I'm suggesting is that this is the historical time for us to be able to critically interpret and redefine what I call the monofunctionalist view of the modern movement, in that, yes?
I think we'll fix the mic. Okay, you want to put it around your neck?
Okay. No, that's not the way to do it.
I can't hear you in the back.
Okay, let's hope that this is better. In that, we still continue to view architecture as something that oscillates between two conditions, form and function, that are very difficult to reconcile, and where one usually is seen as disappearing under the pressure, influence, or emphasis on the other. Yes?
It's almost indistinguishable back here, I'm sorry.
Well, could the super technician come here and fix it? Somebody coming to the rescue? I don't see anybody. What? Well, let's see. What happens if I hold it in my hand? Yeah? Is it better this way? Oh, okay. Good. In any event, so we still have to deal with this particularly artificial dichotomy between function and form. This is a field, or this is an area that still requires a great deal of speculation, for which there hasn't been, or there is no great deal of groundwork done. The only work that I'm aware of is the work of the Czechoslovakian semiologist Jan Mukarovsky, who has talked very lucidly and very accurately about the relationship of the aesthetic component of architecture in relation to the other functions. But the interesting thing about this work is that he views the symbolic, theoretical, practical elements all as being part of a functional condition. Okay? What I'm trying to say is that the question being asked is not so much what does it mean, but ultimately what purpose does it serve. And I think that there is a very important distinction being made in regard to this question. Another element was a normative spatial theory that views interior, exterior, building, nature, and the insides of buildings and of the city as components of a continuous spatial matrix. What I was trying to imply here is that there again we are at this moment in a transitional phase in which the undifferentiated quality of universal space, characteristic of the modern movement, but quite frankly, really initiated with the beginning of perspective in the Renaissance, and of course eventually materialized in architecture through the expedient of the domino prototype of Le Corbusier, So, we have this undifferentiated condition on one hand, and then we have what I guess is being called more or less all over the place an architecture of rooms that is of a spatially differentiated entities that then are, linked in some fashion or another. Well, obviously there is a very important distinction between an architecture of rooms and what I have been calling an architecture of enclosures, given the fact that within the undifferentiated grid of universal space, a room is nothing but a mere enclosure that is more important in its position and its envelope relative to the column of grids than it is in terms of the space that it actually contains. So that I don't think that one can properly talk of rooms in that sense, but of mere enclosures where some kind of partition is designed to shield the most private functions from public view, for example. Conversely, in an architecture of rooms, the texture, the density, the quality, the articulation of the spaces that of the surfaces that define the room become of the utmost importance. In the end, all that one wants demands of a room is to be contained. And at that point, it's probably not even very important or very relevant what is the particular position of this space within a larger building or structural condition. Right? On the other hand, we resort to an architecture of rooms. We express our preference for or a renewed interest in that kind of architecture, while our entire productive system, plus the weight of the tradition of the modern movement, which is definitely with us, and which has formed us to a very large extent, is still alive and prevalent and being built and all over the place. So what I was trying to imply by this business of a normative spatial theory that views interior and exterior building and nature and the inside of buildings and of the city as components of continuous spatial matrix is, again, a speculative studies, not only of a critical written nature, but more importantly, in the projects themselves, that begin to interweave and make a synthesis out of this architecture of enclosures and of this architecture of rooms. In fact, what I'm talking about is probably a new spatial type, which has certainly not been invented since the universal grid and the domino prototype. Another component was a prescriptive urban theory that recognizes two prevalent and original impulses in the design of American cities. One being the idea of city as gardens with buildings as pavilions, and markings established by a non-hierarchical grid of sidewalks extending into the horizon towards other cities, a type of urban continuity we have yet to understand. I think that this is of especial importance at a moment when, after how many years? 70 years of the end of the City Beautiful movement, there again there is a renewed interest in urban design, not just in planning at the social and economic level, but rather specifically in terms of urban architecture and urban design. However, the available theories, those that claim the attention and the limelight, are those that continue to emphasize the adoption and introduction of urban types that are derived from the traditional European city. And although, of course, there is a great value in these types, and of course, no culture really develops in a totally self-centered, self-contained manner, but rather through exchanges with other cultures. I think that this is happening at a moment where our consciousness of what really the form of the American city and as well as the myth of the American city is really quite undeveloped. So these two hypotheses that I was presenting recognize, in a sense, both the myth and the reality of those urban settlements that were created in the United States, not as a direct response to European models, but rather those that, in a sense, owed very little to existing presence, that were works of the human imagination of those settlers that came here to establish a different society and a different world. And in looking at these early plans, you realize that a very prevalent idea is that of viewing the city as a garden. In fact, anyone who has ever walked through the streets and plazas of Savannah will have to acknowledge that, and it's a miracle that that place has really survived. I mean, a miracle in the sense that it was really way out of the way of the rampant real estate speculation that really changed and modified completely the structure of many of those cities that started as gardens and eventually were transformed into something else. But in Savannah, one senses and one knows that the city could not have been laid out on the basis of a previous city plan image. Something that I always found very interesting is that in reading John Rebs's book, of course, he's an authority in urban planning in America. He makes, in one of the editions of this book, this little reference to the fact that no one really knows what is the origin of Oglethorpe's plan for Savannah. And that many scholars, although he neglects to mention who, unfortunately, many scholars believe that Oglethorpe had been greatly influenced by the work of a friend of his whom he supported, I mean, financially by putting in some money so that this man could publish this book. And then he says, but of course, this supposition, cannot be substantiated because all that this book is just plans of gardens. And it's fascinating because he can never make the extrapolation between the notion that a city can be planned on the idea of a garden, that a city only can come from another city plan. Okay? In any event, that is one hypothesis. The other hypothesis being that we have to begin to, in a sense, redefine and understand the famous grid laid over the landscape as those innumerable plans of Midwestern cities and basically show. Not so much as this ominous presence of logic that disregards the topography of the landscape, but rather as a way of envisioning the grid as a system for the exchange of energy that was non-hierarchical, and undifferentiated and neutral, so that, in a sense, what becomes most prevalent is the exchange that takes place in the streets and in the sidewalks. One can begin to interpret the grid as basically a system for social in this society during the past decade, although they were clearly initiated during the 60s. The 60s were, of course, the time where my generation basically spent its formative years, and now we are going into the 80s, which is the decade where my generation will probably be producing its most mature and significant work. So what I would like to do next is show you two of my projects. They are not theoretical projects, they are real life projects with real life budgets. meaning lousy budgets, obviously. And I want to show them because they hopefully will give you an idea in a rather perhaps didactic fashion of in which way I have fulfilled some of the requirements of this program in the past. And later on, I will show you 4 projects done in collaboration with my students at Syracuse University that will begin to give an idea of how I plan to go about my work, next. So I think that at this point we could turn it on? Good. Okay. This project implied the renovation of a small portion of the old pension building in Washington, D.C. Charles Moore, Stanley Tigerman, and myself were commissioned about a year ago by the General Services Administration and by the National Endowment for the Arts to take over 2 rooms each in the periphery of the great courtyard of the old pension building for the specific occasion of the 4th Federal Design Assembly. The Design Assembly is an event that is organized every 2 years or so by the federal government to involve roughly about 1,500 bureaucrats who don't have, I don't mean it derogatorily, but you know what I mean, who don't have any specific formal training in architecture and design, but who on a day-to-day basis make decisions that affect architecture and design of the federal program of buildings and all kinds of things, I mean, furniture and graphic programs and so on and so forth. So since they can't send anybody, or everybody back to school for a few years, what they do is every 2 years get everybody together in some city and just blitz them with seminars and lectures and exhibitions and you name it, right? Now, what was a little different about our commission was that a committee of the National Endowment proposed that rather than having another exhibition about the quality of architecture, that 3 architects would be asked to design the lounges for the various groups of delegates so that they would be at once lounges, that is places where these people would meet, relax, eat their lunch, have their little meetings, whatever. Second, or actually the order doesn't matter really, but also statements about architecture, so that people would not look at an exhibition of architecture, but that they would experience architecture. And third, that all of these would be fulfilled with no money at all, simply by utilizing materials and finishes and furniture and lighting that could be obtained through the GSA schedule, right? Now, the building itself is a rather a remarkable building in that, in that it was very closely designed and inspired by the Palazzo Farnese. The designer of the building was General Meigs, who was an army engineer, equally fascinated by classicism and by technical innovation. And he was a self-professed functionalist. He wanted to design this building and its grand interior space so that not only would be beautiful, but it would be a good place for the workers to be in. In fact, He designed, for example, the grand staircases with very low risers so that they can almost be ascended like a ramp. It's actually quite remarkable, and there is a great deal of this care and detailing throughout the building. In spite of its classic influence, this building had been scheduled many times for demolition. To begin with, because of its red brick skin, it was deemed being in the same category as the other federal Victorian buildings of the period, and it was axed, or X'd rather, out of the grand plan produced by the Macmillan Commission that, of course, included Olmsted, McKim, and Daniel Burnham. Somehow the building has survived and now is scheduled to become a National Museum of Architecture. Eventually, when Congress passes the bill for the $20 million that the renovation is going to take and so on, we'll have such a museum in this country. This slide depicts at the bottom the ornamental frieze that runs around the building itself. And I think that this is of interest because this ornamental frieze depicts just, army troops. I mean, no war heroes, just the soldiers. And is one of the very few uses of ornament that I have seen where the ornament exists there to refer to the building's function. Which is, of course, a very peculiar use of ornament, in that ornament is always deemed to be, that which is done beyond necessity and function and references. Obviously, without the war, there would have been no veterans. Without the veterans, there would have been no pensions, and without the pensions, there would have been no building, right? Okay. This image is an image that I found doing research on the building at the very, very beginning of the conceptual stage of the project. And it depicts the building in construction, but basically the spatial promenade through the rooms in the periphery of the grand space, which unfortunately I don't have a slide of because it's absolutely remarkable. But in any event, all of this was lost throughout the years because all kinds of partitions were built up, and this sequence was completely cut off. The building actually is in tremendous state of disrepair at the moment. But it was an image that impressed me a great deal and that then I completely forgot about. It was only much later when I was asked to assemble some material to present the project that, looking in my files, I found the Xerox of the image again. And then I realized how deeply it had influenced the design. So that, it was totally internalized and put away in the back of my mind, and I didn't remember any longer. But of course, it was very much there. This conceptual diagram shows one of three aspects that I would like to emphasize didactically as exemplary of the kind of work that I do. First, it seemed to me that perhaps one of the most important things to communicate to this particular audience was one of the most difficult things to understand about architecture, which is how architectural space is actually articulated. This is, of course, very important for us. We do it all the time, but it's very difficult for people who don't have any specific architectural training to understand, that it is essential for the creation of architectural space to be acutely aware of the elements which articulate it. So I thought that I would take this as an opportunity to show to this audience, how that exists. So the diagram depicts the room, one of the rooms, there were two, and it shows that the room actually was not a single entity at all. You say a room, a single room, but turns out that this room, this particular room, had a shallow, very beautiful shallow vault at the center, where bits and pieces of a structure, were showing sort of baldachin, holding up this vault dome. And then there was a zone at the entry of the room with a lower ceiling, and another zone between the dome and the exterior wall. So both zones were treated as belonging to either the interior or the exterior condition and painted and carpeted to express literally that. You know, in one case, the stucco finish of the wall facing the interior courtyard, and in the other case, reference to the red brick of the exterior facade. So in a sense, I was turning both facades towards the inside. The structure itself was articulated by using charcoal paint, which of course is a sort of Renaissance device, and the building had been of Renaissance inspiration. And then the upper part of the diagram shows that two of the walls had some kind of mirror paneling. In one case, the paneling covers the entire wall, and in the other case, on the other side, there is a partition that is slightly separated from the entry door towards the next room, you know, which was cut off by a partition. And that mirror partition has the shape of the smaller arch that would have existed on that wall. See, what happens when you put, of course, you know, one mirror in front of another is that you create an infinite axis, visual axis, that is activated by the presence of an observer, you know, in interrupting that kind of condition. The plans depict the second aspect, which was the interpretation of the activity at hand. That is, I was supposed to do the editor's lounge and the graphic designer's lounge. So I made an interpretation of the behavior pattern of these two groups, QA groups, obviously. And the editors, obviously, are these people who tend to relax after 5 o'clock, cocktails in hand, in stuffed, comfortable chairs in settings like clubs or the Algonquin Hotel bar in New York City, and presumably many other places like that. They have verbal exchanges with other people of a very intimate and close nature. So what they get basically is you know, a club seating arrangement you know, for their lounge. The graphic designers, the poor devils, are more like us. That is, they work longer hours. They are lucky if they can relax, you know, in minutes they take away from, you know, the work they are doing. They need pads of paper and table surfaces to be able to express their ideas to whomever they happen to be communicating with. So basically what they did was to get a sort of conference table arrangement that included these chairs designed by Ambassan Piretti that you can use to take a nap when you relax completely, and when you're ready to go back to work, the chair goes right back with you into a forward position, right? So the notion was here that if the editors came to talk to the graphic designers in their own turf, and if the graphic designers went to talk to the editors in their own turf, just by the particular seating arrangement, you know, obviously there would be an understanding of the particular role and pattern that was being, you know, displayed at the moment. On the other hand, I must say that one could have thought of any possible number of other furniture combinations of many different kinds. This was just specific to that question, but one could take that away completely and replace that by auditorium seating for films or whatever, you know, it would have been. The third aspect, well, that is just a blow-up of the plans. There you can see a little bit of the zones that I was talking about. The third aspect is depicted by this other conceptual diagram, and alludes to the fact that although the club and the conference room may have been totally appropriate to the two groups involved in these, the exhibitions were still supposed to function at another level. The lounges were supposed to function at the level of public exhibitions, open to anyone who wanted to come in and experience them, right? So the lampposts, which are in the streets of Washington, D.C., are brought into the rooms to restate that public, you know, by a very known and legible, you know, piece of street furniture, it restate the public character of the spaces, and in extending the street quality into the rooms themselves, beginning hopefully to suggest that the really valuable interior space of that building was the great courtyard itself. And those are two, I guess, sections through the rooms. And that is the graphic designer's lounge looking towards the exterior zone. Now looking towards the interior zone. And now looking down into the axis, visual axis. And the second one is the editor's lounge with not too handsome furniture that we had to get at the last minute because the other one, did not arrive in time, etc. Although it really doesn't matter, in the sense that each one of the components was dealt with in an autonomous fashion, so that taking one away or replacing one does not destroy the quality of the others. Looking now towards the exterior zone, and now looking into the visual axis. Now, in dealing with the activity or the function in this particular way, I felt that the conventional distinction made in between form and function is not so much resolved as it is actually exposed. Or rather, perhaps there is an unusual resolution, because mirror surfaces stand for a representation of mental space. They are virtual and enterable spaces, and they are also the place where the unself-conscious person who would come to use the lounges and the self-conscious persona would finally meet face to face. And that is, that was also an important thing that I wanted to convey. To design a space so that it can be experienced in a relatively unself-conscious manner, and at the same time also be experienced, depending on the particular state of mind of the observer, self-consciously as a work of architecture, as a work of art, is, of course, very difficult. In fact, Le Corbusier has talked about this, and he says that to do so is really a feat for acrobats. And then he says, and an acrobat is not a clown, because the acrobat with his reckless turns is happy to prove once again that the mockery of the audience, as far as architecture is concerned, can still be avoided. The second project is a project for a shopping mall in, well, the drawings for this are in exhibition in the gallery now, but it's a shopping mall, a suburban shopping mall in southern New Jersey. One side of the strip looks like this. The other side of the strip looks like this. And in this area, like in many other parts of the country, through the agency and efforts of various environmental groups and neighborhood organizations and so on, finally an ordinance was enacted that required the institution of what they call a beautification zone, which forbids developers from tearing down any trees at all within 100 feet of the highway, other than for the purpose of putting in a driveway to the building. Now, obviously, this is going to change a great deal the look, the appearance, and the experience of American strip architecture. We'll have to rethink Venturi all over again, right? It will do, of course, several things. It will probably reinstate the notion of frontality in these buildings rather than the continuous proliferation of the fragments of buildings sort of like reaching to the edge of the highway. It will give a different character and importance to the idea of design, and usually these kinds of ordinances are passed along with very stringent requirements for the size and type of sign that you can put in. In any event, the particular site for this suburban shopping mall was one on the other side of the strip where the forest had already been raised completely to make way for the building. This is just a conceptual drawing that, as I describe the building, will make it clear that it tries to depict some of the certain aspects of the idea for the building. The site plan shows the building, of course, 100 feet away from the highway as the ordinance requires, with parking to both sides, and it's basically a basilica plan. And as some of you possibly remember, the basilica was originally a commercial type and it was later on adapted as a religious building type. So here the basilica is used in its original inception as a commercial building type. On back of the basilica there is, through the device of a joint, the anchor of this shopping mall, which is a Chinese fast food restaurant. This is real life, kids. Okay. And the parking stops at the joint, other than for the delivery driveway and and the garage driveway on either side. Okay? The plan shows the basic organization of the building. There is a drop-off point at the entry, toilets and payphones and that kind of thing, and then a promenade towards the center flanked by the shops. The budget for this building and the ultimate cost estimate for the building was $22 a square foot, including all site work. And then, on back there is the plan of the restaurant with the takeout. Of course, you can also enter from the parking into the joint itself. You don't have to come all the way to the front to enter. And there is this takeout place, all the fast food booths to either side, and then family dining in the back, sort of like facing whatever remain of the trees in the side. And 2 side verandas for outdoor dining. And there were 2 optional screens, not contained within the $22 square foot budget, for shielding the verandas from the view of the McDonald's parking lot next door on one side and something else on the other side. Okay. The project is structured, and that is an axonometric of the same thing. Huh? Okay. The project is structured by these 2 facades. The first facade is the entry facade, is that sort of folding screen at the entry, built of glazed concrete block in 3 different shades of green that would be pre-mixed in the factory so that people wouldn't, the masons wouldn't have to think about the pattern. They will just randomly pick them, but they will be mixed in different proportions of different types of green so that it will be very dark on the most frontal part and then much lighter towards the end. The structure of the building, which is made of precast concrete columns, this red grid articulating the promenade towards the center, is allowed to protrude into the outside, received by this folding screen and with an awning canopy at the entry itself. The rest of the structure is conventional open web truss and sheetrock, the usual. The second facade, is the bottom one, is the end of the promenade. Obviously, you can enter the restaurant from this facade, but the restaurant itself, that is the little building of the restaurant, is actually detached, only joined through a knuckle with this much more monumental urban scale element. And it has steps, and it has two little windows through which you can look at the building of the restaurant, behind. And the pagoda-like shape of the entry is actually a negative form rather than a positive one. That whole entry piece is something that, as you will see in this section, is something that can only be read the way you're looking at it through the experience of a Gestalt apprehension, in that all these elements are actually disjointed and they are at different planes, so that they appear to be reconstituted as a single entity, although they are not. The grand facade defines basically the social space of the building. Like in many other places, in the nearby town, there is absolutely nowhere where young people can go and hang out, and other than, of course, in paid places. And the notion of the social space was one that would allow some kind of respite from the obsession of, or the compulsion of consumption and circulation, so that you could finally arrive to a place, where you can simply sit, and enjoy the scene. Needless to say, the owner, co-owner, because the banks own most of these, but the co-owner of the shopping mall, who was also the owner of the Chinese restaurant, wanted the building to have a very strong Oriental character. And he understood that it would be very difficult for the owner of a small pizza parlor or gyro sandwich place, who would presumably be a tenant of this mall, to be able to identify it with an overt pagoda imagery. So the Oriental Chinese character of the building is derived from the very logical and very strict principles of traditional Chinese architecture, which was mostly based on the design of the section of the building. That is all that architects did for centuries. The structural system was set, and then they specified the proportions of the section and how many bays this building would have. After they did that, in came the artisans and did all the other stuff, the pagoda curve, the carved brackets of the structure, and so on. But that was a whole realm of expression that the architects themselves did not control. To the rationality of building, which was greatly influenced by Confucianism, was then opposed the figure of the garden itself. And I'll have to backtrack quickly to show that the central garden is really formed by the collapse of two traditional motifs in Chinese landscape design. And all of this is much more complicated than the way I'm going to say it, but for the sake of expediency, I'll have to resort to just the bare bones of the idea. Landscape design, basically, the landscape designers viewed nature as that which was other, that is, outside of human rationality. And that is why water and an element which they called the strangely shaped rock were such prominent components in the design of gardens. These strangely shaped rocks were dragged from obscure and remote locations into gardens, and the more irregular they were, the more valued they were, because they could not be subsumed within any kind of logical, rational system of thinking. So that the fountain collapses the idea of the brook and the idea of the strangely shaped rock into a single entity that is basically, I guess, a sort of crevice in the floor of the mall itself that would be made of fiberglass with a hidden copper tube running the length of the edge, and just letting water slide very slowly towards the center of that space, of that fountain, which was 4 feet wide at the widest point. in a sense, deflecting circulation towards the perimeter of the shops on either side of the fountain. Okay, now another collapse of technology. This is not working out. Okay, let me see. Okay, thank you. These elevations show at the top the back facade of the restaurant, the part that faces the forest, that is the dining area. In the middle, in a much more enlarged scale, was the design for the plywood screen wall to either side of the veranda. And then at the bottom is the facade of the section through the restaurant looking back into the wall of the shopping mall. Next, please. Thank you. The side facade shows that the building acknowledges that it is a product of the car in allowing the color of the parking surface to wrap up the side of the building, there again made of glazed concrete block. And in a sense, compressing or articulating the building in this fashion, emphasizing even more the linear procession from the entry, which I guess I forgot to mention, the monumental green facade is really designed as a memorial to the forest that had been raised to make place for this building. So that from that memorial or monument to nature, you eventually go through the building towards nature itself. And that was simply a building done somewhere through the middle of the design of this project that articulated some of the main ideas of these. And when you work in these kinds of projects, you know, where the line between you know, reality and I wouldn't say fantasy, but the desire to bring meaning and life, you know, into the real world is a very thin line. You have to do things like this to remind yourself through the everyday decisions, you know, regarding cost and maintenance and bank deadlines and so on. What is it that you were trying to achieve in the first place? Okay. The second part of the presentation will deal with a very different kind of thing. This was, as I said before, work done in collaboration with my students at Syracuse University on the occasion of a spatial studio that I ran there about a year ago. And that it dealt with the problem of housing in the specific context of some of these significant social changes that have taken place and have institutionalized themselves in pretty specific forms during the past decade. I don't know if this is going to be surprising or a boring and known fact to you, but anywhere between 7% and 10% of the number of households in the United States are made, and I should say only anywhere between 7 and 10% are constituted by a full-time male wage earner and a full-time female homemaker, and the 2.5 kids and so on, right? And this is a decreasing proportion, a decreasing minority. Nevertheless, most housing still continues to be designed to fulfill the assumed or real needs of this decreasing minority. It is estimated that within the next 3 years, over 60% of all the number of households in this country will be made up by 2 working parent families or by single working parent heads of household. Leaving the polemics aside, I think that this particular fact alone is telling us that we have an incredible challenge in our hands. It is unfortunate that architects have devoted the better part of their energies during the past century to designing housing where the assumption was that a woman's place was in the home. But as unfortunate as this has been, the reality of the situation is that that is no longer the case, and that certain kinds of urban and suburban housing patterns are no longer viable because there is no longer a full-time chauffeur, full-time shopper, and full-time child care worker within the home itself. I suppose that one could take in relation to this challenge an attitude similar to the one expressed by an editor of a magazine which ran a roundtable discussion in which I participated when we had the first meeting concerning this. He, who also happens to be an architect, said, well, really, I don't understand what this really means, and in any event, obviously, it didn't affect his own life, but I don't understand what this means. And besides, when people are ready to build these things and they have their programs and so on, we'll just sit down and design them. All of this is fine and well, but the argument that I'm trying to make is that unless some research and speculation on what this housing indeed would be like, when that moment comes, all that would happen is that there would be some perfunctory and probably erroneous adaptation of some known type condition that will not fully exploit and realize the possibilities of supporting this kind of lifestyle. So the project given in the school was one that most basically acknowledge that working women and their families are a very important and a strong constituency that can be appealed to for the revitalization of the city. The site was located in the city of Syracuse, which is in a sense paradigmatic of a great many northeastern cities. That is, where there is a great deal of empty parking space where housing once existed and was taken down to make place for some grandiose urban renewal proposal that was actually never built. So in this case, the two sites are sites that were once very crowded and alive with housing and other kinds of things, and are presently empty parking lots. And there are a lot of parking lots in Syracuse. Even to the extent that one of the projects that you will see includes absolutely no parking whatsoever, the assumption being that the last thing that Syracuse needed was even more parking space to be added. The projects, therefore, should be looked at first as speculative conditions. And in this respect, I believe that the schools of architecture have a very important role to play in the production of theory, in that these schools of, our schools of architecture are the environment where this kind of speculation can be produced in a very serious and systematic way, and in that way affect some of the thinking and the consciousness of the practitioners outside. So they should be looked at as speculations. They have some very successful parts, they have some very problematic parts. The whole project was done in the duration of a regular semester that is 15 weeks, where the first 3 weeks were devoted to reading and analyzing the literature on housing, as well as the ideological basis for housing design, and where the fourth week was devoted to the graphic analysis, well, conceptual, I mean diagrammatic analysis of 15 housing projects which I selected, some built, some proposed, where these projects were tested through 5, or analyzed in terms of 5 typological categories. One was relationship of the building to the site. The second one was hierarchy and type of activities, degrees of privacy and publicness, and so on. Circulation, of course. The third one was structural, systems and materials. modular or not, whatever. The fourth one was, I guess, what we could call environmental technologies, orientation, use of passive or active energy systems, and so on. And where the fifth one was aesthetics, that is, proportion and character of the buildings and of the building elements, as well as symbolic aspects in which the building was capable of communicating something to the city, to the users, to whomever, to architects, whatever. So that the actual design really took place in 8 weeks. The first project is based on the idea that it is perhaps possible to, something else that I would like to mention before I get into the actual description is that it was assumed that the constituency for this particular project would be one formed by either former or would-be suburbanites. In other words, people who, if the suburb had the infrastructure of services, would have obviously gone there or stayed there. But these people can no longer afford to drive 25 minutes to drop a kid in school, 45 minutes to pick up the laundry, 15 minutes to do something else, and so on and so forth, so that you want to be very close to these services. It also became very clear that housing thought of in this context can no longer possibly be envisioned as a single building condition, that it has to include right from the onset a discussion of the kinds of infrastructure services that are going to support this kind of possibility. And these most prominently include childcare, the possibility of some kind of either communal kitchen arrangement or conversely some kind of restaurant takeout food facility where you can, like in, for example, the Scandinavian countries, you can take out a subscription so that you can come back from home, pick up a decently cooked meal that is not too expensive and take it home and eat it there. Or conversely, if you live alone, you could sit down and eat it along with other people from the neighborhood that you would know and would want to do the same kind of thing. As well as other kinds of facilities, but these happen to be rather crucial in the envisioning of these housing ideas. The mode of ownership envisioned as a test was one of mixed cooperative and condominium. And in the infrastructure required for the project was included a great deal of rental retail and office space, and two kinds of housing, which would help us further emphasize the differences between one kind and another. We talked a great deal in the studio about the houses and the housing, and the houses being the kind of housing that was most closely designed to refer to the structure of these families, and the housing being more conventionally designed apartments that would be for more transient population and would be basically rental profit-making units. As part of the program was also incorporated a health facility with some swimming pool and saunas and that kind of thing, which is very badly needed in Syracuse because although a great many people are into that, you have to drive 40 minutes out to the suburb to get to this rather ugly, not very appealing environment to be able to do this. Also, it was included in this consideration the fact that one of the reasons, although obviously it's not the only one and perhaps not even the most important one, but one of the important reasons why people like to go to the suburbs is because there you have, the house, which is a singly defined, perfectly legible entity sitting on its own piece of property. In other words, the pavilion surrounded by its own little park, which obviously implies the possibility of a control over the way you live and, and what you do with it. And also allows you to open the front or the back door and be in direct contact with nature. So that there again, both the independent legibility of the object house, so to speak, together with the relationship with nature became an important consideration in the project. So in the first example, the aspect to be emphasized is that it was the idea of trying to make an urban spatial matrix that would actually be originated by a single detached element. And I guess that, that is pretty clear from the figure ground plan, where you see the original element being detached towards the edge in a site that ends the downtown